Hello, my name is Thea Newman. I'm the Director of Solar Avis. This video is planned to be the first of a series which examines the impact and efficacy of the COVID vaccination programme in the United Kingdom. The Office for National Statistics has been releasing datasets that track the mortality rates for individuals in England in each of the vaccination status groups. It's a very rich dataset. In this first video, my aim is simply to extract some of the most basic information from the dataset and to plot it for each age group and for both sexes. What we'll be able to look at in this data are the timelines of mortality in each of those groups for people with different vaccination status. The video here will be quite methodical because I think it's very important as we look at this data, because it impacts everybody, that we understand what we're looking at, what the strengths and weaknesses of the data are. So if you'll bear with me, I'll start off with some background and then go through the methodology of how the figures are made, and then we'll get to the figures. And I'll wrap up the video with some brief comments. So we'll start by giving some brief background on the ONS dataset and very quickly describe our methodology on creating the plots. The Office for National Statistics has been providing these datasets on all-cause and COVID mortality rates separated by COVID vaccination status, namely those individuals unvaccinated or who have received 1 dose, 2 doses, or the booster. The datasets cover about 79% of the population of England, of those aged 10 and over. We'll be using the most recent dataset, and this covers the period January 2021 to May 2022. Now, the ONS does provide graphical summaries of key points, but I do think it's important for academics and citizen scientists like myself to probe the data, have a look themselves, and maybe they will see things that will be helpful that should be raised for public discussion about the impact and efficacy of the COVID vaccination programme. The ONS has stressed, quite rightly, that care must be taken in comparing mortality rate data across different vaccination status groups. The simple reason for this is that depending on a given individual's health situation, they may not have received a particular vaccine dose, or they may have received it early, and so on. So when looking at different vaccination status groups, one cannot know at a given time really the detailed profile of individuals in that group, and so it's very careless to directly compare mortality rates across those groups. What we can do, though, and what we'll be doing here, is looking at timelines of all-cause mortality for the different vaccination status groups. This will give us a lot of information, I think, about, again, the efficacy and impact of the vaccination programme. Very briefly on methodology, our approach is to use as little additional calculation as possible with the ONS data, because that would be a source of possible error, and we want to be as secure as possible with this data. The one step we will be taking is to group together within a particular vaccination status whether people have had that dosage recently or further in the past. Those are separated in the ONS dataset, but we're going to group them together for simplicity. This can be done, but we will not be able to use what's called age standardization. This is not problematic because the age ranges of each group are quite small. Typically, we're looking at 10-year age ranges. So this step that we take, although a simpler method, is not problematic. And finally, before we go on to look at some data, I want to stress that when you look at these kinds of plots, it's very easy to get confused. We're always plotting mortality rate on the y-axis. we will not be able to show on a given plot how the group size is changing over the time period. And the group size within a particular vaccination status will change for various reasons. Either people will be entering that group having had a particular dosage, or they'll be leaving that group having had an additional vaccination, or sadly they may have actually passed on. So group sizes will change dramatically over the period, but that will not be visible in the plots themselves. We've worked hard to make the figures as informative as possible, but not with too much information on, because then they become confusing. So very quickly, we'll just go step by step to see how one figure is made, and that way everyone will be clear about what the graphs are representing. So here is an example of one of our final plots. This would be for females in the age range 50 to 59. You can see there's quite a lot going on here, so what I want to do very quickly is show you how we build up this plot from the ONS data. If you'd rather skip these details, you can use the timestamps to go straight to the final plots, but I think you'll get more from these by knowing really how they're built and what they're actually representing. So here's a small portion of the very large ONS dataset. We're looking at all-cause mortality for females, and this is month by month. Here in May 2021, we're looking directly at the age group 50 to 59. And you see the data is broken down by vaccination status. So those women in that month, in that age group who are unvaccinated, those who've had a recent first dose, those who've had a less recent first dose, and so on and so forth. And for each of these, there are the number of deaths that occurred in that month, and essentially person years is the size of the group. Now the ONS calculates something called age standardized mortality rate. We will not be using that for a reason I'll discuss very shortly, but we can also trawl the dataset for that information if we wish. What we'll do is go through the dataset for each of the 17 months and capture that data here for females aged 50 to 59. So for the different vaccination statuses, the number of deaths and the size of the group. And we'll make a data file such as this for each of the age ranges, and these are the age ranges that the ONS defines. So we can't get any more detailed than these decade age ranges. It's actually unfortunate that we have such a large age range in the young adults here, because there'd be a lot of information that's lost by grouping together people in their 20s and their 30s, but that's just, we can only use the data that we have access to. So there will be 14 files in all for each of these age ranges, females and males, and these have been created by SolarArvis, and I'll make them available on the SolarArvis website for people to use if they wish, and the data has been checked, it's all correct directly from the ONS dataset. Now what we can do is define something called the crude mortality rate. It's just the number of deaths in a group divided by the number of individuals. We can plot that crude mortality rate for each month. So we're doing that here for females aged 50 to 59 who are unvaccinated, and this is the so-called crude all-cause mortality rate, and it's per 100,000 individuals. Now, this is slightly different to what the ONS calculates. They calculate something called the age standardized mortality rate. Now, we can't actually calculate that from the raw data ourselves because we don't have enough detail in that raw data. Now, the reason that we want to calculate crude mortality rate is because when we look at vaccination status, we want to group together recent dose and not recent dose. And because we don't have enough raw data to do age standardization, we have to do this crude mortality rate. But what I'm showing you here is that if we take the ONS age standardized mortality rate for, say, the unvaccinated group here, you see that it follows beautifully. And the reason is because the age range is small. So the age standardization is not a critical step when you're looking at such a small age range. So our calculation of crude mortality rate will be fine within a small very small tolerance. Right, so we can do this now across all of the vaccination statuses. So unvaccinated, 1 dose, recently, 1 dose, less recently, and so on. But the problem is, if we do it for all of these different vaccination statuses, we get what I would call a dog's dinner. I don't think this is a very useful graph. There's just too much information here. So instead, what we'll do is group together the 2 vaccination status groups, recent 1 dose or not recent 1 dose. And we'll do the same for 2 doses and the same for 3 doses. And this will allow us to have a much more clear plot. So when we group together, you see this plot now is much simpler to look at. So the purple curve will be those individuals in a given month who are unvaccinated. Green is for those in a given month who've only received 1 dose. Blue for those in a given month who've only received 2 doses. And then orange for those in a given month who've received 2 doses plus the booster. And you can see that that only starts in September when the first boosters were beginning to be rolled out. So this is the data that we'll be presenting for each of the age ranges. Just a couple more things before we go on to the final plots. First of all, the rollout of first, second and booster doses was essentially prioritized by age. And so when we look at a given age range, it's helpful to know, well, for people in their 50s, when was the first dose mainly be given out, when was the second dose mainly be given out, and so on. So on each plot, the green dashed line will tell you that was the peak time for when the first dose was being given to that age group. The blue dashed line is the month when the peak second dose was being rolled out, and the orange dashed line is when, for that age group, most people in that age group were being given the booster. And these are very helpful milestones, I think, for each of these plots. And lastly, because we're trying to get a lot of information across in each plot, I'm not showing error bars on the points here. The ONS dataset does have estimates if you're interested in confidence levels on each of the data points that they calculate. What I am doing here, though, is if we have a particular vaccination status in a particular month where very few deaths occurred, obviously there will be a lot of fluctuation in that particular point. So if there are fewer than 10 deaths in a group in a particular month, we just note that by placing a circle around the point, and that really means that these points are highly uncertain, so you shouldn't place too much weight on points where there's a circle around them. They just have a high error level. So that's all that needs to be said about the methodology and how we create the plots. We'll now move on to show the data across all of the age ranges. And now let's look at the figures. So here are the plots then finally of the ONS data, and I'll be presenting them from oldest to youngest across the age ranges, first for the female datasets and then the male datasets. So we start with females aged 90 plus, and I'll just try to point out a couple of things in more detail on this first plot, and then we'll go a bit faster with the others, and you'll see that some of these features are quite robust. Well, one thing to notice is that we see a lot of variation as time goes on in the 1-dose vaccination status and the 2-dose vaccination status. It's quite important to realize that as time goes on in this green status group, the size gets much smaller, because essentially most people in this green group will have moved on to the blue group once the second dose becomes available. So we get quite a small group as the time goes on for this green curve. Similarly, when the booster becomes available, most of the individuals in the 2-dose group will then go into the orange group having received a booster. So again, this will become quite a small group. So this large variation that we see in 1 dose and in 2 doses is something that we'll see across most of the data sets. Something to bear in mind as we look at these also, it was what was going on with COVID at the time. Well, at the beginning of 2021, we were still in the ravages of that terrible second wave of COVID, so there was quite a lot of mortality going on at that time. So we should be very thankful that the vaccine became available for vulnerable groups around that time. The Delta wave in England was surging around, I think, June, July time, and the first Omicron wave, November, December time. So it's worth bearing in mind as well in the background, when were these big waves of variants coming through the UK. What other things do we see here? Well, it's interesting that the unvaccinated group, obviously high mortality here because most people were basically, well, in this age group, unvaccinated still here, high mortality, that coming down very rapidly. But of course, also bear in mind that this group size would have shrunk very, very quickly too, because a lot of people moving out of the unvaccinated group having received a vaccination. It stays relatively constant really for most of the period, then reducing in the spring of 2022. And that's something we'll tend to see across these data sets, quite interestingly. Another thing we'll tend to see is in the booster group, particularly amongst the older populations, that it tends to start with quite a low mortality rate, rising up, and then actually staying fairly constant through the spring of 2022. So if we look at females aged 80 to 89, again you see here these large variations in the 1-dose and the 2-dose groups. And again, just stressing very much that most people will have left this green group as the second dose became available. Most people will have left the blue group as the booster became available. Again, we note that the unvaccinated group stays relatively constant through summer and autumn of 2021, and then starts to fall in the I just went forward there, tends to fall then in the spring of 2022. And again, we see this sort of constancy of the 3-dose group in terms of mortality rates through the spring of 2022. Sorry about that flicking just then. My finger slipped on the mouse pad here. So here's females, 70-79. And I won't go through this in great detail, but you're seeing those features here essentially again. Notice that these dashed lines are moving to the right because as we go to younger age groups, the vaccine rollout will have been at later times for the younger groups. Females age 60 to 69. So we're still seeing these large changes in the 1 and 2 dose populations. We're seeing this relative constancy of the unvaccinated mortality rate, and then that decreasing over the spring, and the relative constancy of the 3-dose group in terms of mortality rates. Females aged 50 to 59. It's worth bearing in mind that the y-axis here changes very dramatically as you go to younger groups, because the overall sort of the absolute mortality, of course, goes down very sharply. We are looking at all-cause mortality here. So as we go to younger groups, these numbers will shrink significantly with each younger age group. But what's interesting is, though, that the shape of the curves is relatively similar, even though we have much smaller numbers of deaths. So these large changes in 1 and 2 dose, relative constancy of the unvaccinated group, and then that declining over the spring, and again the booster group staying relatively constant over the spring in terms of mortality rate. Females aged 40 to 49 now, and those features perhaps less clear now in this younger age group. And then finally, the youngest age group we have available, and sort of frustratingly, a lot of age range there concatenated into one group, and we have no choice there. That's just the way the ONS presents the data. So people 18, 19, in their 20s, in their 30s, all lumped together. And I think that's why we see less clear signals here, because really there's a lot of information lost by grouping all of those age ranges together, but we have no power over that at the moment. But still, we can see some of these features, the unvaccinated group declining in mortality rate over the spring, and the 3-dose group staying relatively, steady over the spring. These circles up here simply mean that there were some very high but highly uncertain mortality rates early on in the 2-dose group and in the booster group, and I would presume that's because in this young age group those were prioritized to severely vulnerable individuals who sadly would have naturally high mortality rates. And we can go through the same age ranges now for the male population. I won't go into quite so much detail here. The main reason being, interestingly, that actually there's very little obvious difference between the main features across men and women. And remember, this is all-cause mortality. The absolute figures tend to be a little bit higher for men than women in a given age range, and that's just the usual demographic we see for mortality rates. But in terms of features, at least at a first observation, they tend to be quite similar in a given age range between men and women. So here we have men 90 and over. We see these big changes in the 1 and 2 doses, as I've described before. We see the relative constancy of the unvaccinated group and then declining in the spring. And we see the constancy of the booster group in the spring of 2022. Men 80 to 89, so very similar comments there as I think I've just made. What you do see in most cases is that the lowest mortality rates will be in the second dose group before the booster becomes available, and then in the booster group. But as I say, one has to be careful comparing actual mortality rates across these groups, as the ONS has advised. Yes, and here we have men aged 70 to 79, very, very large changes in that 1-dose group there and the 2-dose group. We see the unvaccinated mortality rate fairly steady. Kind of interesting, this fairly steady through Delta and Omicron, and then decreasing in the spring, whereas the booster group, again, fairly constant over the spring in terms of mortality rates. Men aged 60 to 69, you see very, very similar features that we've been discussing. Males aged 50 to 59. Quite striking here, again, the constancy of mortality rates across the booster group there. We see a big decline here for the unvaccinated group. Again, quite interesting trajectories there and timelines. And males aged 40 to 49. A lot of uncertainty in some of these early points here, so one shouldn't pay too much heed to these when there's so few deaths in a given group, in a given month. And finally, males aged 18 to 39. And similar remarks as I made before, that this is actually quite a large age range that's been grouped together, so I think things are less clear here. Right, very good. So those are the plots, and I'll make all of these plots available on the Solar Arvas website so that people can peruse them at their leisure. And we'll wrap up with some brief comments on the main features that the plots have shown us. These are not hypotheses or theories, we're simply trying to summarize what the main features of the curves are. So from these plots that we've been looking through, I think these are the following sort of obvious observations of timeline trends. First of all, the main features hold both for the female and the male datasets. We see abrupt changes for the 1-dose and 2-dose groups from low to a sustained high, which does actually come down over the spring of 2022. And these changes tend to occur with the introduction of the subsequent doses. we should bear in mind that in the background there are these surges of Delta and Omicron variants. One doesn't want to make a causal connection between these things at all at this point, but it's just interesting to recognize some of the sort of synchronicity of these things. I think the simplest explanation for these abrupt changes might simply be that individuals in a particular group may simply be too desperately unwell to receive another dose, and that would be one explanation for why we see these increases abruptly in mortality rates in, for example, the 1-dose or the 2-dose groups when new vaccines become available. The 3-dose group generally has the lowest mortality rates in absolute terms from October when it was rolled out onward. But as I say, one has to be very cautious in comparing actual mortality rates across groups, as the ONS has advised. Something which is, I think, quite striking, though, is that the 3-dose group mortality rate stays fairly constant over the spring of 2022, unlike the mortality rates in the other vaccination groups. And I think one tends to expect that mortality rates, all-cause mortality rates, decrease from winter to spring. This is what we normally see in mortality rate data. Perhaps a decrease of around 25% in mortality rates. We see this in the other vaccination groups, but not in the 3-dose group. And that's simply an interesting question, I think, that we can investigate further. The trajectories for the unvaccinated group and the 3-dose group pretty much converge for most of the groups that we're looking at, the age groups and such, by the last period, May 2022. And in fact, in some of the younger age groups, and also interestingly the very oldest age group, these mortality rates actually cross over, in fact. But I say that just with the usual caveat to be quite cautious comparing mortality rates across vaccination status groups. And just to finish by saying that the ONS dataset can be obtained at that very long web address there. You'll be better off probably just Googling that. And they do very helpfully give methodology themselves, which is also available at that even longer internet address there. For those who are interested, there's quite a useful, I found, a technical briefing on how to calculate mortality rates in public health statistics, and I just give the web address there. I'll put the PDF file of that briefing on the Solar Arvus website because I think that might be quite a useful resource for those who don't do this every day for a living. So with that, I would like to just quickly thank my friend G at MTL, who prompted my interest in this data set and has been very generous with their time in discussing the creation of the plots. And I'd also like to thank E. Lundell and H. Newman for assistance with data checking to make sure the data we're presenting here is as sound as we can possibly make it. I hope you found this presentation interesting and useful. The data that's being produced here is available to everyone. I will post the slides on the Solar Arvus website and everyone can download them and use them as they wish. The COVID pandemic and the vaccination program has impacted every single one of us, and I think that the more people that are involved in the discussion in trying to understand what's happened and what the ramifications are, the better. We'll be taking a deeper dive into the data set in future videos, trying to use the data to answer more specific questions. With that, thank you again for your interest, and I'll see you next time.